In the last video, I talked about developing the script for the short film I'm currently working on. The script development stage is of course predominantly written work, whereas this video will cover more of the visual work, because for this part I want to talk about developing the director's concept for the film and preparing a lookbook. For the sake of the episodic nature of this video series, it makes sense to separate these processes like this, but really I'm thinking audiovisually while I'm writing, and I'm thinking about the script while I'm working on the audiovisual elements. It's not a clear delineation. But this is what happens when you try to explain a fluid, undefined process in a clear, structured way. You can't always represent it as it really is.
What is this bullshit?
Like last time, I'll start off with the more conceptual stuff and then move on to the practical stuff. So if you want to just hear about lookbooks, then skip to one of the later chapters in the video. Like with the process I mentioned before, this is going to make it seem like I made all of these clear, logical steps and decisions in the process of developing the concept, because I'm looking at it in retrospect. But in reality, it was a lot messier and I tried out different ideas and got stuck regularly. Don't be worried if your process is a lot messier than what's depicted here, because mine definitely is.
I'm only human, Harry!
Now let's move on to the process of developing a director's concept. So like I mentioned in the last video, the original idea was inspired by Edward Hopper's painting, Nighthawks. The idea of the stillness of this image and the scene it depicts stayed with me visually. It also reminded me of Roy Andersson's films, which often have a painterly quality to them and were another key influence. The scenes usually play out in long static takes. The result is a relatively objective depiction of the scene, at least with regard to the framing. It's not intended to be visually difficult to digest. It also gives the scene a theater-like quality, which I'm not such a fan of, but this is where choosing to shoot on location can create at least a bit of distance from that feeling. But I like the format of these kinds of scenes. You see it as well in Jim Jarmusch's Coffee and Cigarettes. I think this objectivity gives the viewer the freedom to explore the frame and the performances as they wish. By choosing to watch one of the actors through the entire scene, you can give yourself a completely different experience of the film to watching another actor. Or you can choose to explore the background. Basically, you're not visually told, hey, look at this. You can choose to explore freely.
Tell us about your latest film.
I was interested in following a similar approach for my film because some of the scenes present situations that have opposing opinions or questionable reactions, and I wanted to try to keep these oppositions at least somewhat balanced, so that a viewer can make their own assessment of the situation and then argue about what was right or wrong later. I definitely knew my stance for each of the scenes, but through the process of working through the scenes with the actors, even my opinion changed on some of these situations. So I guess you could say that the goal I aimed for as a director was to strive for objectivity in the portrayal of the scenes. Now, achieving absolute objectivity in a piece of fiction isn't even remotely possible. Every sentence of dialogue I chose to write and every bit of scene direction I chose to give is inherently subjective, but it was still the intention to aim for objectivity. Let's call it subjective objectivity.
What?
So I'm thinking about easily digestible wide shots that'll be able to capture the performances of all the actors throughout each scene. For some scenes, it's straightforward. 2 people sitting on a bench, easy. But for other scenes, you might have to adjust the blocking, which is how the characters move throughout the scene, or you might have to use elements of the location to your advantage. The key takeaway here is that I'm making all of the decisions for the scene based on what happens in the scene and the experience of the scene I want to create. If you know your scenes well, I mean if you thoroughly understand the core of a scene, what its actual purpose and contribution to the film is, then all of the decisions on how to capture the scene become easy. Or at least easier.
Motherfucker, it can't be that hard. It's just lift versus drag and rotation.
If I know this is a heavy scene about processing grief and fear of vulnerability and intimacy, then every decision I'm met with becomes a question of whether it adds or subtracts from the core of the scene. So if a production designer suggests bright pink curtains, I just have to imagine it in the scene, and for me it's a no because it distracts from the core of the scene. This is obviously a simplified example, but that's the approach I would take. So now let's get practical. You have some ideas floating around in your head, or maybe even a clear vision, but you need to be able to communicate that with people. And one of the documents a director typically uses to communicate their vision is often called a lookbook. This is a document in a presentation format that communicates your vision for the film, predominantly using visual elements and text. Now, the term lookbook is also used in industries like fashion, and commercial directors often refer to it as a director's treatment, but in the film industry, the term treatment describes a structured, text-based summary of a project. So if you're a bit confused, ignore all that shit and focus on what's important. You need a document that communicates your vision to your collaborators. By the way, your collaborators might also make their own lookbooks. Your cinematographer or production designer might gather more ideas to make sure you're on the same page and to make suggestions. It's a great way to visually consolidate your ideas.
I've trusted in your visions.
But now let's focus on your vision as a director. In a previous video, I already explained what's usually included in a lookbook. Instead, for this video, let's go through the actual lookbook I prepared for this film to see what worked and what you should avoid. Keep in mind, I prepared the lookbook for this film before I had my cast and crew, in part to share my idea with potential collaborators, so it can't just be functional, it also has to be persuasive in this case. If your team is already set, you might approach this slightly differently. What I'm showing you is one way to do it. Even looking at it again, I'd normally work more extensively on the lookbook. This one's kind of brief. But I take a slightly different approach for each project, and you can take whatever approach works for you and your collaborators. Again, there are no rules here. Do your thing.
Let's get weird, buddy. Let's get weird.
So here we are in Google Slides, which is what I currently use for lookbooks, mostly because I use Google Workspace, and also when I make changes to the document, I don't have to send a new link or file. It's just updated. But most tools will let you do that anyway, so you can really use whatever you want. Keynote, PowerPoint, fucking Canva, whatever lets you communicate your ideas in the most effective way.
Well, whatever works for you.
Anyway, pretty basic cover slide here. It's always great if you already have visual material prepared for the film to integrate into the lookbook. I didn't, so I tried to find an image that kind of summarized the idea of the film. So in this case, I used an image of an homage to Edward Hopper by Philip Lockwood. Since each of the scenes in the film are supposed to be a window into people's lives, it seemed fitting, although it's maybe a bit on the nose.
Well, it is a bit obvious.
Hopper was also a key inspiration for the film, so it seemed appropriate. The next slide jumps straight into the idea. Usually people would include a logline and synopsis, but I knew I would be sending this lookbook to potential cast and crew, so I wanted to jump right into communicating the core feeling of the idea and not a dry recounting of the plot, since in this case there kind of isn't a plot.
I'm not sure how enticing that sounds.
Which brings me to the primary things that should define how you approach your lookbook, the film you're making and the people who are going to see this lookbook. That means that firstly, every slide of your lookbook should best serve the project you're making, like in my case, leaning into the more flowery aspects of the concept rather than the non-existent plot.
Not much to go on, is it?
Lean into the strengths of your film rather than following conventions for the sake of it. Secondly, you should keep the audience of this lookbook in mind. This isn't like the audience of the film that comes out at the end, where you can say, if they don't get it, then that's how it is. This is a document your collaborators will use to make sense of your vision. They need to understand what you're trying to communicate.
What is happening?
So in my case, to hook potential cast and crew, I have this slide that starts with some vague, overly poetic rambling, one facet of inspiration, the intention of the film, and the approach it'll take. You might say some of this, particularly the start, is not communicating much, but in this one slide you have a fairly decent idea of what you're getting yourself into. I know that if someone read this and is still interested in the project, they'll probably get the rest of it, and they'll be a better fit for the project. This is how you can find people who actually stand behind your vision. Don't hide the fact that your film might be a bit pretentious or just simple entertainment. People will figure that out later anyway, so let them know as soon as possible. Also, another Edward Hopper painting just to put out the vibe.
I'm gonna hang by the bar. Put out the vibe. Okay.
While we're on the subject of your lookbook's reader, this is a perfect slide to learn from. I included some production details on this slide, which normally people don't do, by the way, but I added it for practicality and to make sure whoever's reading is available and aware of the shoot dates. I originally had a lot more information here, but then realized that for the cast and crew, most of it wasn't relevant, so I condensed it down to the essentials. Try to keep in mind who's reading for every slide. Then the next slide is a core team slide with a link to previous work. I should have really updated this as more people were attached to the project. I think it also just helps people to visually see who's working with you. Again, not always included in a lookbook. So now we jump right into the first scene. I think I should have really included a slide to explain the structure here. Seeing as the film doesn't follow a conventional narrative structure, it didn't make sense to me to follow a conventional lookbook structure. That meant that seeing as the scenes are independent of each other, I decided to cover each of the 6 scenes separately using the same format.
Something simple and repetitive.
So it's always one slide with the characters and their potential looks, one reference image for the scene, and then a short scene synopsis. Then there's always one slide with costume ideas and a framing reference for the composition of the shot. This image was actually taken on a location scout, so originally I picked frames from films I liked, but then replaced them with pictures from location scouting to make it closer to what we were actually going to shoot. We ended up shooting in a different location, but this was a more representative reference than what we had before. Scene 2 now, same format, characters, reference, synopsis, then another slide with costumes and framing. This obviously repeats itself now for each of the scenes. Usually you would have a separate slide or section for costumes, framing, etc. But it made more sense to group these together by scene because, like I said, each scene stands on its own. They're not connected by plot.
Fine by me.
So even though I had framing references for each of the scenes, I actually added those slides later in the process. Originally, I had these composition and lighting slides and decided to keep them in there because I think they still help communicate the feeling of the scenes. By the way, for composition and lighting references, I usually source the images from online resources like FrameGrab, which is free and probably my favorite one. There are also paid resources like ShotDeck and FrameSet, which I'm testing out at the moment, but let's see if I stick with them. There are loads of options out there though, so I'll probably stick some links in the video description if you're looking for something. For costume references, I usually use Pinterest because every time you click on a picture, you find loads of related examples under it, so you can keep getting more specific until you find exactly the reference you're looking for.
I know exactly what I want.
Then moving on, we have 2 slides for post-production. This is all a bit vague or more just to give an impression because I know that for me, typically a lot changes in the process of working through the different stages of post-production. Normally I would go into a bit more detail on the editing slide, but since these are mostly one takes, there isn't that much room for a lot of editing, or so I thought. More on that when I do the video on the editing process.
Wait, what?
With regard to sound and music, I've pretty much changed my opinion on everything written here now that I'm in the stages of post-production. But it's good to start thinking about this before you shoot in case you want something specific that requires you to record or change something on set. These slides now cover some of my influences, which were, like I mentioned, Edward Hopper's paintings and Roy Andersson's film structures. While I think this is relevant and useful information, I put it at the end because I think it's just not as pressing as the information that comes before it. This is like, if you're interested, this is where the idea came from, just for context. Lastly, there's a contact slide, so if someone finishes going through the lookbook and is convinced by the project, they can immediately get in touch with you. Or if you're already in pre-production, it's still good to have it there so your team can always get in touch with you. Okay, great. So now you have your idea and vision summarized in a lookbook. When people ask about the film, you can send them the script and the lookbook, and they'll have a decent idea of what the film should be like. I would also recommend including GIFs, links, and audio and video clips to make it more immersive and to communicate things that just don't come across with text and images. I would usually do this as well, but I don't seem to have done it for this project.
Some lazy bastard just waltzed in.
But I would say this about summarizes my approach to developing a visual concept for a short film as a director. Then, once things start getting hands-on as you move into pre-production, we'll start talking about rehearsals, location scouting, and previs. But that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.